Hello and welcome to the podcast edition of our new show. It's called the Indy Jigsaw Show. Episode 1 coincides with the anniversary of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We're joined with guests from Scottish CND to consider how are we going to get rid of Trident from Scotland. If you'd like to watch the YouTube version of this show, it is on the Independence Live's YouTube channel. Hello and welcome to episode 1 of the Indy Jigsaw Show. And Marlene's going to tell you what the main theme of this episode is.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Fiona. So the main theme is all about nuclear weapons, Trident, the ones based down the Clyde, how we might get rid of them. Is that possible? We've got 3 guests coming in. We have Bill Ramsay. So Bill is the convener of the SNP CND group. And we've got Isobel Lindsay. Isobel is co-chair of Scottish CND. And we also have John Cairns, who has recently joined Scottish CND as their campaign coordinator. In the background to this conversation, this week, end of January, is the first anniversary of the UN Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And in March, there's going to be the first of what will be a COP meeting for that treaty. It's going to be in Vienna, hopefully in March. Sometimes these things are getting postponed a little bit at the moment. The UK CND have commissioned a report being written by Dr. Rebecca Johnson, who is somewhat of an expert on UN nuclear arms treaties. The report is called Nuclear Weapons Are Banned. What does this mean for Britain? So Dr. Johnson launched that report just a few days ago, and that's going to form the background to our conversation with Bill and Isobel and John.
And before we get to the interview, there was a debate in Holyrood opened by Bill Kidd, who of course has worked very closely with the United Nations in their campaign to bring this treaty about and has been a real champion for many, many years in the Scottish Parliament.
So the next clip is Bill Kidd, MSP, who is opening the debate in Holyrood last week to mark the first anniversary of the TPNW. I think I've got those letters okay now. Anyway, for those of you who are not so familiar, Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I think it's not that widely known that Bill himself was included in a nomination for Nobel Peace Prize a few years back, 2016-17, I think it was, part of a group of people who were nominated for all their campaign work for non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. So here he is.
This Saturday coming marks the 1-year anniversary of the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. As the motion for this debate highlights, the NPT Review Conference was scheduled to take place this month. However, as you may be aware, this was postponed due to the pandemic, and it is now likely that the NPT Review Conference will take place in August, where I am determined to be able to attend in person as the head of delegation for PNND, or Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and that's why we use the abbreviation, as you can tell. As co-president of PNND, I thought I laughed there because I thought it was fun. As co-president of PNND, I will be representing parliamentarians from across the globe who are committed to seeing the implementation of total nuclear disarmament. Today, we are debating 2 international treaties: the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or NPT, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, otherwise known as the Ban Treaty. Both of these are of critical importance to nuclear disarmament. Firstly, the NPT has been in force since 1970 as a landmark international treaty through which nuclear states committed to stop the proliferation of nuclear arms. The UK, the US, Russia, China and France, all of whom are permanent members of the Security Council at the UN, are nuclear state members of this treaty. It is therefore a highly important international treaty that needs to be respected by all of its members, as it underpins critical international security structures. The treaty commits its members to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons technology to other countries, and to stop an increase in their own nuclear weapons stockpiles. Moreover, in signing this treaty, the P5 members all committed in international law to further the goal of achieving nuclear disarmament and actively work towards complete nuclear disarmament. So this treaty is hugely important, and yet the NPT entered into force over 50 years ago, and total nuclear disarmament very obviously hasn't been achieved. Moreover, there are worrying instances of non-compliance from nuclear states in recent years, including from the current UK government. As international security concerns heighten and the world changes, we need fresh impetus to encourage nuclear states to renew their investment into the nuclear disarmament process. I believe that this is where the new international treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, or the ban treaty, comes in. The threat of nuclear arms has not diminished, and the commitment of nuclear states to no first use of these weapons is welcome, but it's not enough. The nuclear disarmament debate needs to be reframed, and diplomatic thinking needs to be renewed. Nuclear armed states need to reconcile their security strategies with the moral question of whether nuclear weapons would ever be right to use. Nuclear weapons are indiscriminate. They do not target only a military base, and they actually devastate entire nations, including hundreds of thousands of civilians who in any country cannot afford to have to bear the weight of the actions of their leaders. The ban treaty is, like the NPT, a landmark treaty. For the first time ever, non-nuclear states and civil society led an international treaty on nuclear disarmament. This, perhaps ironically, helped the NPT in its 50-year-old commitment to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons to non-nuclear states. The SNP has stood firm in its opposition to nuclear weapons, along with the many invaluable civil society organisations here in Scotland, as MSPs from across the parties continue to do in our CPG on nuclear disarmament. I must mention, as convener of our cross-party group on nuclear disarmament, that here in the Scottish Parliament we stand for the majority wish of the Scottish people across parties in our commitment to ridding Scotland of the nuclear weapons that are currently stored here against our will. As many here will be aware, the international NGO called ICAN was the driver of getting the ban treaty into the United Nations, accepted and ratified in international law. They won the Nobel Peace Prize for this work, and an atomic bomb survivor, who many of us have met, an incredible woman called Setsuko Thurlow, accepted this award on their behalf. After the atomic bomb was first made, her fellow Nobel Peace Prize winner, Albert Einstein, commented, "I do not fear the explosive power of the atomic bomb. What I fear is the explosive power of evil in the human heart." As much as the deterrence argument can persuade some, I believe it can never rule out or compensate for this aspect of the reality that evil actions do take place and can sometimes override the good governance of nations. The only way out of this is through total nuclear disarmament and continued oversight of international agencies on compliance. Although until recently the Cold War had felt gone, long gone even, and it could easily be pushed to the back of our minds, the threat of these weapons has not diminished. We have a responsibility, whether Scotland is devolved or independent, to look at this reality head-on. I am pleased that the majority of MSPs have signed the ICAN pledge to support the ban treaty, and this means that there is enough political will and commitment within this Parliament to stand together in working for an end to the danger to the world's long-term future that nuclear weapons stand for. Going back to our cross-party group on nuclear disarmament, I want to take this opportunity to mention the work of all the organisations involved in the cross-party group on nuclear disarmament, who have continued in their efforts over the years to promote the nuclear disarmament agenda amongst Scottish parliamentarians and the general public of our country. I must particularly mention Janet Fenton, the ICAN Scottish liaison and chair of Scottish CND, who has worked tirelessly in this regard and been a tremendous help in the cause. Alongside these partners, I will be attending the first meeting of state parties in Vienna this March, COVID rules allowing, to develop the ban treaty rules further, and I encourage my fellow MSPs from across the chamber to do likewise, if at all possible. And I thank you very much indeed.
Now that we've had the scene setting from Holyrood, let's go and meet our special guests for this month.
And I'm very pleased to welcome our three guests with us. So we have Isobel Lindsay, Bill Ramsay and John Cairns, all associated with Scottish CND, as you've heard. So thanks all of you for being prepared to come on the programme. The Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Can you just tell us something about this treaty? There have been previous UN treaties connected with nuclear weapons. Could you say a little bit about how this one's come about, and is it different in any way from previous efforts?
Yeah, I think the origins of this really go back to about 2010, actually go back a bit longer than that in a sense. And the Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference in that year produced a lot of frustration, but this had been building up because the origins going back to 1960 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty was a kind of deal, a kind of bargain, that the existing nuclear powers at that time would maintain their nuclear weapons at that point, but other nations would all sign up to a commitment not to go nuclear. Now, this, of course, was at the end of the 60s. You had all the campaigning, all the crisis like Cuba and concerns. So that was a big step forward. Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty committed the existing nuclear powers, although they were keeping their nuclear weapons for that period, but to take serious efforts to ensure that they would be working towards the total abolition of nuclear weapons. Now, key players on the non-nuclear side among the nations were getting more and more frustrated because the nuclear powers were just treating that Article 6 with contempt, far from stepping back in terms of they were constantly modernising and developing and so on. So there was an anxiety to do something else, to take this forward separately. And it started with several conferences. Norway convened one, Mexico's was another, on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear war. And, you know, this was to establish the basic principles. And then this moved on to a number of countries convening a conference, and eventually in 2017 in New York to trying to have a treaty and to make this a United Nations treaty. They had about 150 states attending this conference. Obviously, the UK didn't. We can go on to discuss the implications of it, because it's not just not possessing nuclear weapons, it's not collaborating in any way in their manufacture or transportation, or, so it's very comprehensive. And then what happened was that they managed to they had to get over 50 states signing this at United Nations. They achieved that, so that made it an international treaty, an international United Nations treaty. They now have 59 states who have ratified this formally, and they have another 25 who've signed up to it, haven't yet formally ratified. So it's a big step.
Yes, so it sounds like basically it's come out of the five, well, there's 5 recognised nuclear powers, aren't there? UK is one of them. Of course, there are other states that have nuclear weapons. So it sounds like it's come out of a certain intransigence amongst those nuclear powers to actually do anything. And Bill, if you get anything you want to add to what Isobel's said?
Because of the UK media and because we are in the United Kingdom, the importance of the treaty is downplayed by the media. You've got, as Isobel said, 86 countries started the ball rolling. and now we've got 59 who have ratified. In other words, when you ratify it, it means that you are bound by it. And the other states, other ones, will get round to it at some point when their parliaments ratify it and so on and things like that. Technical reasons will take them time, and probably others as well. But it shows you that the vast majority of the countries of the world, there is a global consensus that something has to be done, and that's the point. And I think in that sense, it's crucial we get across to the independence movement that this is the normal position. It's not just the rational position, which is important, obviously, but it's actually the normal position of the vast majority of states within the world. And like other treaties that have been ratified, over a period of time, more and more states join them until you end up with a small minority who have not joined them. And I think one of the important things is the report that was published last week. Rebecca Johnson was the author of it, and also the one of the organisations that's key behind it, the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, called ICAN, which was important in taking it forward. The main nuclear powers didn't like it; they don't like it, and tried to stymie it, slow it down, and it's not worked particularly well, because now you've got some NATO countries are sending observers, and I mean they're not pleased about that. There was a left government elected in Norway, and they're sending observers, and the new coalition in Germany, they're sending observers, and that's two NATO states, and hopefully that sort of momentum will grow, and so the power of the Permanent Five to keep other states away from the nuclear issue will erode. So it really is quite important. And that meeting in Vienna, it's due to take place at the end of March, though Rebecca mentioned in her presentation last week that depends on the COVID context in Austria at the time. But that really, it's actually a COP. I mean, everybody who will be listening to this, when you broadcast it, are now familiar what a COP is. COP26. Well, actually, the meeting that takes place in Vienna at the end of March is actually the COP1 of the TPNW.
Right.
So it's at that status, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And there are people going from, as well as Bill Kidd, parliamentarians, and Bill is the president of the global PNND, which is along Parliamentarians Against Nuclear Weapons. It's a global organisation of parliamentarians from all over the world. Bill is one of the co-presidents, as well as the politicians, as well as the diplomats from the various countries, the 56 ratifying states. There'll be a lot of people, as there was at COP26, not in the same scale, of course, but there will be representatives of civic organisations, and some of it intend to go as part of Civic Scotland through CND. Yeah.
So, let's hope it never gets as far as its own COP26, and let's hope we can get some. Yeah, it's happening a long time before that, actually. But
can I just pick up on something that Isobel said about Article 6, about not increasing stockpiles but decreasing stockpiles? But of course, last year in the integrated review, the RUK government increased their nuclear warheads from 180 to 260, which is completely in contravention of Article 6. And their response to that accusation was simply to say, no, it's not. And that was as far as it went. So I think a crucial role for TPNW is to pick up on that sort of behaviour and to much more clearly say, this is unacceptable. And that approach is being adopted by the states who have signed, the states who have ratified, and hopefully the other supporting states. So it's a step forward from NPT in that regard, and I think it's a clear role for TPNW.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, it does. That's really helpful to have that perspective on it, and it also sounds like it's a bit different in as much as civic society, civic organisations are being asked to take part in that. Is that correct?
Oh yes. I mean, ICAN, the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, was one of the prime movers of it. And that's a sort of, you could possibly say it's a sort of global civic organisation, and that really is quite important.
The reason why that's very important is, of course, that there's been, as Bill said, there's been a great deal of pressure from the nuclear powers not to have this go ahead at all, over a number of years. And NATO in particular has twisted a lot of arms, not just of its own members, but of neutrals like Finland and Sweden to try and stop them ratifying, which they haven't yet done. So, there's a recognition that what's very important here is getting civic organisations within many of these countries to do the internal campaigning to push their governments.
Yeah.
I think an important part of what Isobel just said as well is the I Can Cities project, that cities within the P5 or the N5, whichever you wish to call them, have signed up to supporting the treaty. So, for example, New York has, which might be quite surprising, Glasgow and Edinburgh both have, Manchester, and there are a good few others. So cities across the world within states that are not supporting TPNW are publicly signing up to support it. So that, hopefully we can build on that momentum as well and put pressure on the governments within those states.
Yeah. ICANN produced a really interesting opinion poll last year on the public attitudes to the TPNW in the NATO countries, and the yes majorities for the TPNW in NATO countries. And I've got a list here: Norway 78%, Iceland 86%, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, Italy, Netherlands, Spain, all well above 70%. The UK is about 58%. But the no's are down in the tens and the low teens. In some countries, like in Italy, 87%, Spain, 89%. So there's large number. The public in these countries very much support it. And interestingly, they did another one about the countries that host this, some of the tactical nuclear weapons or whatever. We don't have the figures for Turkey. But if you take Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, and Italy, Belgium 57%, Netherlands 58%, Germany 83% to get rid of the American nukes in their country, and in Italy 74%. So there is really big public opinion support for the TPNW. But of course, on our media, you won't hear about it.
No.
To pick up on what Bill said about the UK, in spite of the UK's refusal to sign TPNW and actively promote against it, 59% of public opinion in the UK want the government, across the UK, want the government to sign up. And that's 50% Conservative voters, 68% of Labour voters. So it's not just by the normal demographics, it's not by age, it's not by region, it's not by intention to vote. That's of the total public. The public in the UK are in favour of signing, but the government are just completely ignoring that. So even locally, this is true.
Yeah. I think this is where Scotland is so important to the TPNW, for reasons I'll explain, and the TPNW is so important to Scotland. The reason why prospects of an independent Scotland are so important to the TPNW is obviously none of their existing member states have nuclear weapons. But the situation in Scotland is that we are an outstanding example of a country, and there's a specific provision in the treaty for a country which is hosting the weapons of another state and the procedures in place there. But because we are the host, because we've got the biggest site, and certainly in Western Europe, of nuclear weapons, and these are going up in numbers, that if Scotland became independent, if, as we have had commitments to do so, there was an immediate ratification of the treaty, this would be the great example of the treaty in operation, of requiring the UK by international law to remove all of these weapons. And at the same time, it's a great help to an independent Scotland, because we always had the power to say, remove these weapons from Scotland. But it is so much easier if you're doing this within the context of a United Nations treaty with all the international backing of the member states in so doing. So it makes the pathway so much easier for Scotland.
Yes. You've raised one of the points that came up in the launch event a few days back of the CND report, where Dr. Rebecca Johnson, who's the author of the report, she talked a bit about the report and where it came from, but she also said one of the starting off points for her was in trying to think, why do some countries rely on nuclear weapons for their security? I mean, is it real security in the first place? But also, what sort of things drive that? Because those wishes are there, then that drives their policy making. So, you know, what might change that, the direction of that policy making? And she came up with 5 scenarios. At this point, we're going to break away just for a few minutes from Bill and Isobel and John, and we're going to show you a clip from the launch of Rebecca Johnson's report. And this is Rebecca describing 5 scenarios that she suggests could be the kind of scenario, the kind of world events that might just push people, push governments and countries to think again about their nuclear weapons policies. So here she is, Dr. Rebecca Johnson.
And essentially we came to these 5 basic scenarios, and I think they cover, you know, what would be the major ways in which policy might change. But I want to stress they're not consecutive, and they're different. And in a way, what they are feasible, but we don't know if they're likely. Some more likely than others. But we start with the one that should be really the reason for the UK to have security policies, defence policies on anything, and that is what will keep us safe, the security case, and to tie that into the economic case, because you can't get gold-plated security if you can't afford it, and you need to think about what the balances are, and really what are the security challenges of today. So it was to look at that first. But the second of those was looking at the idea of another nuclear accident, a huge shock, or even a use of nuclear weapons, whether by accident or intention somewhere in the world. And that's the kind of shock theory. And that's one that, you know, we're often told is the only thing that would do it. The third one was if Scotland should vote for becoming nuclear-free and independent. And we obviously have Kirsten here as a Member of Parliament from Scotland to talk about that. But this was a very interesting one to look at, because actually a lot of scholars think this is possibly the most likely route to really put the kind of pressures and change the calculus. And then we looked at the kind of idea that, well, the UK actually deep down knows it needs to get rid of nuclear weapons. It's trying to make a club with the other nuclear armed states, or at least 5 of them, that we call the NPT5, but they're also members of the Security Council, and that's all attached to status and those kinds of issues. But Britain's also part of NATO. And we all know clubbable behaviour often means if your friends are doing something, it makes it more likely, more possible. It opens up the discussions a little bit more. So the fourth one was actually, okay, well, we know that there are a number of NATO states that are actually very interested in the treaty. Some even helped in the whole process, the humanitarian disarmament process that led to the treaty. So what would happen, or how could we get to the situation where a number of countries that currently have nuclear deterrence alliances with the US or through NATO were to decide that they actually wanted those security alliances to be nuclear free? What would that look like? And would that have an influence on the UK? And then finally is the one that we're often told is probably the only way we're going to do it, but we have to really question and recognise that a lot of factors come into that, which is the UK votes in elections, and we get governments that decide that they want to be nuclear free and they therefore want not to spend the money on renewing Trident and so on. So those are the scenarios, and in some ways I think that those are actually the most interesting part of the report.
So, having heard those 5 scenarios from Rebecca, we're going to go back to our guests. Those 5 scenarios, now, they are all about focusing on the UK, but obviously if any of them happened, or maybe a combination, they would presumably have ripple effects around the world. So did any of these scenarios strike you? Well, I suppose the third one strikes us about Scotland, but do you think those scenarios are, fair? Are they, do they work?
I think in terms of the first scenario, that we also have to look at what's happening in feminist studies, because a lot of the research that's coming out of the feminist studies about the nature of machismo, the people who have control over the weapons, have come through a particular system within the military and to a certain extent within politics, where being stronger is crucial. Having a bigger gun is an obvious example, shall I say. And I think that's quite important. And also later in the document, Rebecca seems to be not opposed to, but very concerned about the waiting for the accident to happen. That it's really important that we don't have to wait for the accident to happen, and that a lot of activity has to take place to stop the accident happening before we allow the accident to make us stop the weapons, if you see what I mean. So I definitely would pick up on both of those points.
Two things here. The accident thing is really important. When you actually look into it in detail, the number of accidents that have already occurred and have been stopped through some human intervention, someone who has broken the rules, stepped in and stopped it, the number of them is phenomenal. I mean, every few weeks I'm picking up more and more and more. I mean, Brian Quayle, will tell you about loads over the years. Brian's good on that. But the number of, and it's getting, and the likelihood of an accident is much worse. I don't think that any of the nuclear states, and I'm not just talking about the permanent 5, but the others, are likely to use them deliberately. But I think there's a good chance and an increasing chance that there's going to be an accidental launch, because, as we know, because of the development of artificial intelligence and other things, there are bits of the systems that are being handed over. Some of the decision making is not within the human context. I mean, all the powers would swear blind that they are, but they aren't. And this is the same in conventional weaponry as well, with IT coming in and remote decision making, and the likelihood of even more accidents, because they're happening all the time, but even more mistakes is actually going to increase. And there's an organisation called BASIC that has done a lot of work on that particular area. That's particularly frightening in that regard. And the other area, in terms of the supposed rationale, and most people who will be listening to this will have heard of the concept of the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower first addressed in one of his last speeches as president. But actually, I think that needs to be revisited. Just like when people say peace is a self-explanatory statement, well, actually it isn't. And it's the same in the military-industrial complex. The influence of the military-industrial complex is growing all the time. In other words, like Obama, for instance, has started a program of supposed modernization of the American nuclear weapons costing trillions. Even hawks in the United States say that some of this is unnecessary. They come up with an excuse to build a new nuclear weapon. And that is a serious problem as well. They come up with, renewal of this, renewal of that, instead of downgrading, instead of reducing, increasing.
When you say that, are you suggesting then that coming up with upgrading it, a new weapon, that's more to do with feeding the needs of the military-industrial complex than it is to do with the needs of security?
Oh yeah, and there's another aspect to this, which I'm actually at the moment, I'm doing a lot of thinking about this, but nothing in paper. But the analogy, and this no disrespect to folk who are religious or the Catholic Church, but I think the analogy I think of is the 16th century church, when it was one of the intellectual centres of Europe. Now, they knew certain things about astronomy and mathematics. They knew it. But some of the things that were being said for political, cultural reasons couldn't be addressed whatsoever. And so one of the things the military industrial complex gives money to universities in all sorts of ways, so that you now have academics who there are certain things they can't touch or they won't go near. And because I'm looking at these areas, it's fascinating in one sense and unfortunate in another. When you look at the cartwheels, intellectual cartwheels, that some military academics will go through to try and pretend that this doesn't mean that. Well, in reality, they're getting money and they ignore certain things. They simply will not address it. Just like in the 16th, certain issues, if you start to address it in public, then you get burned. Well, nowadays, if you start to address it, then your funding will be cut. And I'm talking about not just in the military, but I'm talking about in the analytical community as well. They simply won't address certain things because it's going to cut their funding.
I think also we should be aware in terms of this kind of economic factor that it does also apply further down the scale in terms of economic interests. It was really quite amazing when Corbyn was at his height. Now, Jeremy Corbyn is a long time supporter of nuclear disarmament, a vice president of CND. I can remember speaking with him in meetings in the early 80s. And yet he was forced to realise, or he was told, that you will not get a commitment but to stop the new Trident programme through party conference. And the reason why that was a no-go area, I mean, I was quite shocked when I saw some of the very left people saying, no, we can't touch this. And the reason why is because you would not get the backing of two big trade unions, the GMW in particular, but because there's also these seem such small-scale things in one sense, but because it's battle between Unite and the GMW for declining membership and so on, Unite couldn't come in because there are all these workers in Barrow desperate for the submarine orders, and they've got members in all kinds of installations. And certainly the military side, I know someone addressing during the referendum campaign, it was a GMW group there representing their military members, and he said it was one of the nastiest meetings during the referendum campaign that he had undergone. This is because there's a lot of understandable economic security, and we can't dismiss this. We've got to be positive about it. And there are unions like Unison, of course, who are very positive because they can see that money that comes away from dense budgets can go into social budgets.
Yes. That obviously identifies, quite a lot of work. Well, I suppose maybe dialogue there about Rebecca's first scenario, because that, it's the basic question. Are these nuclear weapons really making us secure? Are they really kind of safe? And are there not other options where we could produce a world that's as and hopefully safer? And presumably, weapons of some sort would still need manufactured, and the people in the unions involved in that would still get some support from that. So maybe that brings us on to, or shall we go back, I should say, to the third scenario, the one about Scotland becoming independent. So Isobel, you've already kind of, told us that itself would mean there had to be a rethink down in London. And also it's interesting, isn't it, that we wouldn't be on our own negotiating, because we would, if we'd signed up to the treaty, we would get help to carry those negotiations through. So that in itself is a big deal. So Bill, if you've got anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, there's one particular point I think about the support. An independent Scotland, the Scottish state becomes a ratifier of the TPNW. The support that we get from the institutions of the United Nations. So basically the International Atomic Energy Agency and other organisations of the United Nations, we would get their expertise and support. So the idea that it's, small Scotland, and we've dealt with that one during IndyRef 1, but we have the United Nations institutions and experts, and they would be involved in that process. That is a real aid when we get around to the mechanics, diplomacy around the removal. That's really quite important.
Well, one thing I think with independence, it's very important on this issue Now, I'm not in favour of NATO membership. I accept that's SNP policy, and I accept that's a decision that an independent Scotland would have to make. I think it is absolutely crucial that it says the decision to apply for NATO membership, or not apply, but that decision comes after we have sorted out the issue of nuclear weapons in Scotland. And that we have ratified this treaty. Now, the reason for that is that if you applied while you still have the UK's nuclear weapons, every kind of pressure would come on us to delay it. Oh, give them 10 years, rental of the site and so on and so on. So every kind of pressure would come on. But as in all negotiations, if it is absolutely clear, no, we're not even asking for membership until we have dealt with this, then that's different.
I think the NATO issue is a very important one. And one of the key things that should be remembered, she quotes in her paper, the votes. She had 394 for NATO membership and 365 against, a margin of 29. Actually, in the first vote, when the cards went up and counted, it was only 15. So it was very, very, very close. And the point about NATO membership, in my view, it should be used as a diplomatic card. In other words, if you want us to join, then these are the, it's a transactional thing. And the idea that Scotland is too isolated, it's an absurd. Just look at the map of Europe. Scotland is in one of the most geopolitically stable regions of the world. The idea that anybody's coming to get Scotland anytime soon is absurd indeed. I remember there was the Scottish public agree with this, because I remember it was a telephone poll, I grant you, I think, but I believe there was a poll where they asked people, whoever commissioned it, asked people, they thought the likelihood of an invasion of the British Isles. They literally put this, and the idea of an invasion from outer space got 5%, and the invasion of the British Isles got something like 3 or 4%. And of course, that's actually, although that's tongue in cheek, actually that's geopolitical reality. Because if you look at a map of Europe and where Scotland is, we're in one of the most geopolitical stable areas of the world. We're not as geopolitically stable as, say, New Zealand is, but what I keep asking this when I'm in seminars, and sometimes I get ignored by the speakers about this, but I say to them, at what point in the ferry from a Larne to Cairnryan does the purser have to come on and say, a warning, you're leaving one of the most geopolitical stable parts of the world and entering this dangerous and uncertain world? It's just a nonsense. Scotland is nestled in one of the most stable areas of the world. So the idea we're going to be invaded anytime soon is complete tosh. We can use a NATO members. And
presumably, as well as being sort of geopolitically stable, it's also geopolitically important, I would guess, to NATO. Given, we're on where we are and we corner up there. And
actually, it's not. They say it is, but actually, geopolitically important equals, oh my God, the Russians are coming with a GDP.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. The idea that if the Russians are going to invade anywhere, they're not going to invade Scotland. So the idea that the Russians are coming is just complete and utter tosh, because they have a GDP about Italy. And I remember one time when I was an EIS senior office bearer, I was at a conference in Stockholm. There was a chap who was there as an intern, and he was a Russian chap, and he'd served in the Donbass area. I was told this by someone at the meeting. You got to meet this chap, because he was an intern with Education International, but he'd worked somewhere else. And I actually said to him, "But you've only got the GDP of Italy." And he was really offended by it, because the Russians, they will deliberately bang the hard the drum as well. But Scotland is not going to be, in fact, the United Kingdom is not going to be invaded by anyone. That's why the Royal Navy can go halfway around the world, because no one's coming to get us.
No one's coming to get us here. Just going back to what we were saying about, let's get the nuclear weapons and us joining the TPNW in place before we start talking about joining NATO or not. Is signing that treaty something that an independent Scottish government can just do? Or is it the kind of thing there needs to be a referendum about?
No, it's policy. It would be the policy of a political party. Moreover, and Isobel will maybe talk more about this, but the TPNW is actually designed in such a way that Scotland could actually become a signatory. It's not a signatory, a ratifier of the TPNW, and then join a military alliance if it wanted to. So it's not an either or situation. So, but Isobel is absolutely right. We become ratifiers of the TPNW, and then we can look at NATO membership. And if Stoltenberg turns around and says, well, if you people join the TPNW, you can't join NATO, we just shrug our shoulders and say, wow,
Yeah, okay.
They won't do that. They won't. I mean, they'll mumble, but they won't actually do that.
They'll mumble. Okay, there'll be murmurings off stage. And John, you want to come in there?
Yeah, just on a wider effect of independence is what happens to the actual nuclear weapons themselves. Mm-hmm. It would cost a huge amount of money, billions, to move them. Where do you move them to? Now, there are places in England that could take over hosting the nuclear submarines, but there's nowhere that can do what happens at Coolport, which is nuclear weapons storage. They just simply don't have anything. For geographic and what's the word about how deep the stones are? I'm terribly sorry.
Geological.
That's a major issue. Yeah. And they have talked about storing them with the Americans, Leo DeLong in France. And the most bizarre one is that they will create a British overseas territory in Scotland so that they basically can state what they are, but Scotland has no right to say what happens to them. And that's just beyond peculiar.
Yeah, I was just saying one of the very valuable things that the late John Ainslie did, it was during the referendum campaign, produced two very well informed, as all his work was, reports, one on disarming Trident, one on Trident, nowhere to go, showing that getting rid of it here in effect means the UK ceases in effect to be a nuclear power. But the disarming Trident, he went through the details, is not really difficult to disarm because it's a matter of taking the warheads off the missiles, and you remove a pin or so, which the skilled personnel is there to do actually at Cookport, out of the warheads. Now, the disposal, the taking them back down and the disposal of them, Burfield, which makes the warheads, and Aldermaston, which is a lot of the technical skills, that would be their job. What they cannot do, and they would have to have storage facilities developed as well, but what they cannot do is have a place for functioning Trident submarines. They could if they spent an awful lot of money and worked over 20 years to build it, but in practice they couldn't. I think one of the things we should remember to remind people, Ireland has been such a positive player in the TPNW, and as in a number of other international disarmament treaties, it's played a very positive UN role. We've got this situation where there you have Ireland got elected as one of the temporary members of the UN Security Council. They're there for 2 years. Because it's well respected for all the work it's done with the UN and with UN peacekeeping, it's there spending 3% of its GDP on military. So it's an example for us of where you can play a very positive, constructive role on international relations and be safe.
All of this is sort of painting a very attractive, other scenario, isn't it? I know there was the 5 scenarios that we're talking about that Rebecca came up with, but there's also a kind of, for those of us in Scotland, a very, I think, appealing scenario of not only becoming independent, but then, over, say, the next 5-10 years after that, because we'll sign up to TPNW, then becoming independent, and that then starting the ball rolling, maybe, certainly start the ball rolling from the point of view of the UK's nuclear deterrent, maybe even it being dismantled, who knows, but maybe also sending out wider ripples round the world?
Firstly, the technical point that John Ainsley explained to me one day. Nuclear weapons get removed from Scotland all the time. It's just that they come back again. The structures are there to actually remove a lot of the stuff. It's just that it's cyclic.
Yes.
That's the first point. The second point is that the missiles, not the warheads, but the missiles are actually rented from the United States. As John once said, if you're to take Trident missiles, serial number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, in year one, it could be on one of the Vanguard class. And then 6 years later, it could be one on the same missile. Having gone back to Kings Bay and been reconditioned, it could be on an American submarine. So therefore, that shows how, in a technical sense, how easy it is to actually keep them away. However, and the point about England is, and I think we'll have to be careful about this, I believe in self-determination, just not for Scotland, but for other countries. And in that sense, I think that us saying we're going to get rid of them, it's up to the people of England to then decide what they want to do with it. Because the anti-Brexit people, and I was against Brexit, don't get me wrong, I consider it an exercise in self-harm. But there's a danger. I think when Scottish MPs get involved in the after Brexit decision was made, the campaign that was trying to get the UK back into the EU, there's a condescension there, and we can't lecture to the people of England about what they want to do with it. And that's for them to do, because people's vote in England was one of the most condescending exercises in English politics. We have to say to the people, you have your conversation, you decide what you're going to do with it. And I think they need to think about starting to have that conversation now. Yeah. And some of them are, but it's for them to decide what they want to do. Because I believe if we're turning around and say, you've nowhere to put them, that's for them to decide.
I think that's a really good point to bring in as well.
I think the point that you made about raising awareness is an absolutely crucial one. We need to make more of the population of Scotland aware, not only of the dangers in military terms, but of the dangers in political terms. If the UK government, for example, can think about making an overseas territory in Scotland, what else have they got planned? Yes, we do have plans. We are going to be part of a group going to the conference in Vienna for the first member party states. We're starting to build a series of events. We have undertaken a number of events over the weekend around the specific anniversary of entry into force of the TPNW. So the answer to your questions is yes.
Yeah, good. That's great.
I'm really sorry, but on that point, I really do have to go because I'm about to do an interview with Rebecca Johnson.
Oh, good. Well,
it's been brilliant being here. Thank you very much, Marlene. And I hopefully will be able to join you again soon.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, thanks for coming. So, Bill, you want to say a bit about SNP CND?
Yeah. Firstly, I encourage everybody who's watching this to join Scottish CND. That's point number one. To members of the Scottish National Party who happen to be watching this, I would advise you to join Scottish CND, because when you do, when you've got the 2 membership cards, that means that you can automatically become a member of SNP CND. So if you're already an SNP member, you join Scottish CND, you automatically, for no extra cost, become a member of SNP CND. All you need to do is, when you join, you simply say to the Scottish CND office, John and his colleagues, that you want to go onto the SNP CND mailing list. And it means you can become involved in our activities where we speak to SNP branches and whatnot. It was just that point. So if you're a member of of Scottish CND, and you're a member of the SNP, and there are a lot in that situation, and you've not let Scottish CND know, please do so, because then you can become involved in our activities. It was that wee plug. Thank you.
We'll finish there. It's really fascinating talking to the three of you, and again, thanks for coming on the programme. Are either of you thinking of going to Vienna for the conference?
Yes, COVID willing, I plan to go. I'm looking at flights and I'm looking at accommodation at the moment. Indeed, I'm going to be speaking to John, who's just left us, later this week about some of the accreditation issues about it. But I plan to go as part of Civic Scotland under the CND umbrella. Well, I hope to get to go.
Isobel, are you thinking about it?
No, but I certainly hope that the Scottish Government, and even more so the Scottish Parliament, will have an observer or observers there. Yeah.
Hopefully the conference will happen in March, but even if it gets a little bit postponed because of COVID reasons, I would say it's a dead cert that I'll be emailing you to find out what happened at the conference.
I'll maybe send you a wee message,
I will.
With picturesque Vienna in the background.
Yeah, okay then. Thanks again for
Thank
coming.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Well, that was a really interesting discussion. Thoroughly enjoyed listening to that. Do you know what struck me was how both John Cairns and earlier in that David Kelly clip, they both mentioned the sort of toxic masculinity element of the nuclear debate as the kind of, one of the factors, which I thought was quite interesting. What were your thoughts on the conversation there?
I really enjoyed when we were going through those 5 scenarios, what they had to say to them. I mean, so I was rather focused on the third one, but I noticed that both Bill and Isobel actually talked quite a lot about the first 2, and in particular the second one, not so much deliberate use of nuclear weapons, but an accident. And well, indeed, there have been near misses Bill was describing, which I found that quite chilling.
When you think it's only 30 miles from Glasgow as well, the most populated city in Scotland. The other thing that struck me as well was, I think it was Bill describing how we talk about how difficult it would be to move these things, and yet he says, but they're being moved all the time. There's missiles being brought in and out.
Yeah.
And the other thing I found quite very interesting was when Isobel described how easy it is to actually disarm them. You're taking a pin out. Then what happens to the nuclear waste and the rest of the sub is kind of England's problem to decide what they want to do with it. But as far as we're concerned, if it's no longer armed, then that's a big step forward.
Yes, indeed. And I was quite struck when Bill made a point of saying, remember, once we're independent, well, he didn't quite put it like this, but how I'm putting it is, we mustn't fall into the trap of then starting to tell England what they should do about their nuclear weapons. It will be their choice, and if they decide to keep them, well, that is completely their decision. We may think it's not a good decision to have made, but it is their decision. So yes, if Scotland goes independent, it will force Westminster government into a complete revamp of how they're going to look after these weapons, and no doubt there will be some discussion about whether to keep them or not, but that will be their discussion and their decision.
When Bill earlier was talking about the percentages from different countries who supported the treaty, although the UK was the lowest, it was 58%. And we don't know how much what that would be divvied out between Scotland and England, which could well be quite different. It still suggests that potentially a majority of people in England don't want nuclear weapons, and possibly don't want them more when they're on their doorstep rather than ours.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, next, just to sort of round off the discussions, we have Kirsten Oswald, who is SNP MP for East Renfrewshire. She is also the deputy leader at Westminster, and she's chair of parliamentary CND. And she is responding to earlier discussion of the report from Rebecca Johnson that we played the clip of. So we thought it was interesting just to get Kirsten's response to what those 5 points were that Rebecca had
yes,
made.
that's right. She was one of the speakers during the launch. I was listening into it. I did grin myself when I noticed that every time any mention got made of Scotland becoming independent, Kirsten sat with a big smile on her face.
As do we all.
As do we all. Well, as do we all on this on this set of presenters anyway. Okay, so to Kirsten Oswald.
Really positive to see such large numbers of people on the virtual event here, and it has been fascinating to hear the speeches that have been delivered so far, and to give some thought to what's been said. I think there's a lot more thinking to do based upon what we've heard today, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A on the same basis. But I think that Rebecca's report that we're launching today is really important. I think that it does remind us of a road that we've travelled down a long way, but as Julian has very eloquently laid out, we certainly have some way to go there when we try and think about how to rid the world of the threat of nuclear weapons. And I think that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons must be an important milestone on the route to their elimination, and we've heard very clearly why that's so important. And I think that what Rebecca has set out actually is a vital source of information and arguments. It reminds us that over 50,000 nuclear weapons have already been dismantled and destroyed, and the remaining 13,000 are held by just 9 states. So if the UK was to cease to hold a nuclear arsenal, it would join the 95% of countries which already exist without such weapons. And I think what the report also does is to very powerfully undermine the argument that holding nuclear weapons makes the UK safer. Unless the UK is prepared to initiate an immoral and criminal nuclear response to some kind of non-nuclear threat, then these weapons are irrelevant militarily to the day-to-day security of the UK. And, that's, I think, a discussion that we could and should labour on as much as possible. The problem is, I guess, the sad fact is that the UK's adherence to its status as a nuclear power is a throwback to a bygone age. It's one that the current UK government does, however, seem rooted to, and that's perhaps part of its own ideological vision of what Great Britain or global Britain as they see it should be. I think perhaps it feels a bit like nothing's been learned since 1962, when Dean Acheson, the former US Secretary of State, said, "Great Britain has lost an empire and not yet found a role. The attempt to play a separate power role, that is a role apart from Europe, a role based on a special relationship with the United States, is about to be played out." If only somebody had told the European Research Group to do their research. They've basically taken Britain back down a well-worn path, but it's one that leads to a dead end. And in the ERG version of the world, Britain's nuclear arsenal is a key to a seat at the top table. But actually, in reality, it's a millstone around the neck of the UK's military. It diverts funding, it diverts capacity away from their day job, and it leaves armed forces personnel in a very difficult position where they need to try and use resources that are not sufficient to the day job that they're trying to do. So if the UK really did want to be a global leader, then perhaps it should look more seriously at its own paper commitment to nuclear non-proliferation, halt the expansion in the number of nuclear warheads. And I thought it was fascinating earlier on to hear an argument for an extended number of nuclear warheads as somehow being part of a road to a nuclear-free world. And for me, that simply doesn't square. But I think that any steps from the UK in terms of disarmament would send a really powerful message to other countries to stop spending money on weapons that will, as we see it, never be used. And I think that the quote from Dean Acheson also reminds us of how the UK became tied to nuclear weapon systems that make it very much a junior partner to the USA. Because having exhausted its capacity to maintain an independent nuclear capability, the UK looked to America for help. And that's how we ended up with the American-dependent submarine-based Polaris missile system, which was housed at Faslane, not too far from where I'm sitting in my house, actually, just a few miles along the River Clyde, and the Americans' nuclear submarine base at the Holy Loch, also, which had been made available in return for American help. And the arrival of these two bases has played a really fundamental role in shaping Scottish politics, and that's continued to play a part in shaping Scottish politics for more than half a century now. So although the American base is now gone and Polaris is also long gone, and the UK is moving on to a third generation of nuclear missile carrying submarines, and we all know the eye-watering cost of that, there is no way to take this debate out of Scottish politics and out of Scottish discourse. The sidelining of the concerns of people in Scotland about this concentration of nuclear weapons just a stone's throw from our biggest city has created an impact that will, I think, continue to be felt in our politics for a long time. Because all the evidence that we can see tells us that these weapons are housed in Scotland despite the opposition of the people in Scotland, because on a consistent basis, Scottish civic society, the Scottish Trade Union Congress, Scotland's churches, the Scottish Parliament, and the vast majority of Scotland's MPs oppose nuclear weapons. And Scotland's local authorities are also joining the many towns and cities and countries and federal states around the world that are passing or have passed resolutions, usually on a cross-party basis, and that's something that perhaps we could come back to in support of the TPNW, or calling for council pension funds to divest from both fossil fuels and nuclear weapons. And I think that Rebecca's report and the way that it's framed, asking the questions that it does, will help us, I think, to accelerate that discussion, and I think that that's really important. And of course, the Scottish Government has a long-standing position of opposition to the possession, to the threat and to the use of nuclear weapons. And the Scottish Government has condemned nuclear weapons as morally, strategically and economically wrong. And again, I would go back to the report, which does show that this is a distinct discussion that we have here, and I think it's one that's really important to try and extend. And Scottish ministers have expressed strong support for the principles of the TPNW and urged the UK government to sign. So there is that stark contrast in approach in terms of Scotland, where the UK nuclear arsenal is housed, but where we are prevented from signing up to the TPNW, and that of independent Ireland, whose leadership role was critical in the development and ratification of the treaty. And I was interested in the section of the report which talks about independence. Of course, I would be interested in that with my political beliefs, but I think that it's undoubted that an independent Scotland will be a keen signatory of the treaty, and I would encourage everyone who is keen on trying to make a change in the UK stance on nuclear weapons to factor that into your calculations on the way forward, because change is certainly coming here. And Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, joined CND before she joined the SNP. So I think that perhaps speaks to the depth of feeling in Scotland and the long-standing concerns that we have here. Indeed, when she was asked a time ago about a possible coalition government at Westminster, she actually made it clear that scrapping Trident would be a requirement for the SNP in participating in any coalition. Obviously, in reality, it's unlikely that such a coalition would actually get off the ground, because Westminster is so focused on a macho punching above our weight UK culture, instead of focusing on things that can actually make a difference. And I have to say, I much prefer the First Minister's approach to focusing on priorities. And when she was asked if she would use nuclear weapons, she said she had a moral objection to weapons of mass destruction, and that she would not be prepared to press a nuclear button that might kill tens of millions of people. So if I could borrow another phrase from Dean Aitchison, he said, "There'll be no learning period with nuclear weapons. Make one mistake and you'll destroy nations." And the report goes on to highlight American records on the use of non-nuclear drones in terms of revealing patterns of failure there, which have caused the death and injury of many civilians, including women and children. And of course, the people who control these drones are just people, just as those who are in control of the nuclear weapons are. And we heard about the pressure that, of course, would exist if you were in that decision-making situation. So reality tells us that errors and miscalculations can occur to any of us at any time. And I think that that's one of the key points that we need to really try and focus governmental minds on when they're thinking about nuclear weapons. Not only about when they can never be used, which in my book is never, but also why such a dangerous a dangerous and unchangeable weapon should ever be part of an armoury at all. And I guess that if I'm moving to a conclusion, that some of the things that really strike me are that Rebecca's report drives home the message that we're not on a linear path to nuclear disarmament. Part of Trump's legacy is the loss of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and part of Boris Johnson's legacy is an increase in the number of UK warheads, which of course is contrary to its treaty obligations. And that has made Scotland once again an unwilling accomplice in the storage of these. So people in Scotland, and I hope that people across the UK too, are increasingly clear that money spent on Trident leaves large gaps in the defence budget. It means that we are paying a price in terms of jobs. The MOD's own figures show that while the MOD is prepared to spend so much, such eye-watering sums on Trident renewal, they're cutting defence jobs in Scotland. And I think that the report's recommendation to look further at the work carried out by the Scottish Government Working Group on a Scotland without nuclear weapons could help us to find a way forward more broadly. And I'm sure Rebecca would have a view on that as a former member of the group. I know that she may share the frustration of the chair, Bruce Crawford, at the limitations that the group faced at some points because of the split of reserved and devolved powers. But whether these frustrations or the other frustrations and barriers we've heard about today, I think that we must persist in trying to find ways to discuss this and trying to pin down some of the real concerns and the reasons why this is so problematic. And I think that that's a pretty clear message that comes through today. And I would absolutely encourage people to have a look at the report. It's set out in a way that makes it entirely possible to look at the different sections and not be overwhelmed by the amount of information there. So I've no doubt that we will have a significant degree of discussion about that ongoing in months to come, and I would really welcome that, but I think that's probably time for me to stop.
So that was Kirsten Oswald's response. Now, if you would like to read Rebecca Johnson's report for yourself.
Very straightforward. Go to the UK CND website. You can download the report. The report itself, just to say again, is called Nuclear Weapons Are Banned. What does this mean for Britain? If you'd like to watch the launch itself, so you'll get a lot more of what Rebecca said, and there were other people there who were also responding to the report, you can find that on the UK CND Facebook page, and you can watch the video.
I hope you've enjoyed our first episode. Just a couple of things coming up that we wanted to let you know about. On the 22nd of February, if you're not sick of the sight of me and Marlene, you can watch us again on our other show, Maybe's Eye, which is more for people who are undecided about independence. So,
first episode of Maybe's Eye, the other new show, will be on
Tuesday the 22nd at 8 o'clock.
Put it really briefly, Maybe's Eye. What we're looking to do is produce good material about the kinds of topics that are of real concern to people who have not yet made their mind up about independence, and maybe just kind of maybe's aye, maybe's no. So we're going to focus on the kind of subjects that are of concern to them. And well, you and I might be out and about with our new fluorescent jackets for doing Vox Pops.
We might indeed, and they are very fluorescent, having road tested it on Saturday. It really is. I imagine we could be seen from space.
And second episode of this show, that'll be coming up on March the 4th. Don't know exactly yet who will be part of the show, but two people who definitely will, I'm going to be talking to them together, are Eileen Budd, who is an illustrator. With her will be Iona Fife, who's a very well-known Scots singer and also champion of the Scots language. It's due to Iona that on Spotify you can now say that you're singing in Scots.
So that's it for this month and for our very first episode of the Indy Jigsaw Show. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll catch up with you all next month. You've been listening to the first episode of the Scottish Indy Jigsaw Show, produced for Independence Live Media. The hosts were Fiona McGregor and Marlene Halliday, and the music was Kevin MacLeod's Inspired. You can contact us by email on mibby'seye@independencelive.net.